Sometimes the thing we're running from has 4 legs and knows exactly where to find us. Del Waverly had spent 30 years fighting fires, and now all she wanted was peace in the mountains with her old dog, Scout. But Scout kept escaping to an old cabin in Fern Hollow. The locals said it had been empty for 30 years. Del followed him one day, thinking she'd find nothing but old wood and maybe some animals. What she found inside changed everything. The cabin was frozen in time, like someone had just stepped out for a moment 30 years ago. And what she discovered there would force her to face a mystery that felt too much like her own past. But what could make a loyal dog abandon his master's side for a place most people feared to approach? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge, like memories that refused to fade. Del Waverly stood on her cabin's front porch, coffee mug warming her weathered hands, watching Scout nose around the woodpile with the methodical patience of a dog who'd learned to savor simple pleasures. At 58, she'd finally found what she'd been searching for without knowing it: silence that didn't echo with sirens, and mornings that belonged to her alone. The fire department badge sat in her top drawer now, its brass surface tarnished with age and the weight of 30 years' worth of emergency calls. She'd polished it the day she turned it in, 18 months ago, but couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Some things carried too much history to discard, even when that history felt heavier than it should. Scout's ears perked up, and Del followed his gaze down the mountain trail that led to the valley. A red pickup truck wound its way up the gravel road, dust trailing behind it like a question mark. Roy Dalton, the mail carrier, made this trip twice a week, bringing supplies and gossip from Pine Ridge in equal measure. At 72, Roy had been delivering mail to these mountain folks longer than Del had been fighting fires. And he knew every secret these hills held. "Morning, Del?" Roy called out as he climbed from his truck, mailbag slung over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. His movement still carried the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades walking mountain routes in all weather. "Got your medication from the pharmacy, and Mabel sent up some of her apple butter. Says you're looking too thin." Del smiled despite herself. Mabel Hendricks ran the general store in Pine Ridge with the fierce attention of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. She'd taken it upon herself to worry about Del's eating habits, as if a woman who'd spent 3 decades running into burning buildings couldn't manage to feed herself properly. "Tell Mabel I appreciate it." "But I'm eating just fine," Del said, accepting the small jar of apple butter along with her mail. The pills were for the arthritis that had settled into her hands and knees, a parting gift from years of hauling equipment and climbing ladders. Nothing that stopped her from living, just a reminder that time had a way of collecting its debts. Roy's eyes drifted to Scout, who had wandered to the edge of the clearing and stood facing southeast toward the deeper mountains. "That dog of yours been acting strange lately?" Del felt something tighten in her chest. She'd noticed it too, Scout's restlessness. The way he'd stand at the cabin's windows for long minutes, staring into the forest with an intensity that seemed to pull him towards something she couldn't see. "Strange how?" "Mrs. Patterson down in the valley said she saw him running loose yesterday afternoon. Said he was heading toward Fern Hollow." Roy's voice carried a careful neutrality, but Del caught the undercurrent of concern. "Ain't nothing up that way but the old Torino place." The name hit Del like a cold wind. She'd heard whispers about the Torino family since moving to Pine Ridge, fragments of conversation that stopped when she entered a room. An abandoned cabin, a family that had vanished 30 years ago, and the kind of silence that settled over a community when tragedy became too familiar to discuss. "What happened to them?" Del asked. Though part of her already suspected she didn't want to know, Roy shifted his weight, the mailbag suddenly seeming heavier. "Vincent and Maria Torino and their little girl Sophie lived up in Fern Hollow, maybe 5 miles from here as the crow flies. Vincent worked as a surveyor for the mining companies, did good honest work. One morning in 1993 they were just gone. Car was still in the driveway, coffee was still warm on the stove. Like they'd stepped out for a walk and never came back." Dell's hands tightened around her coffee mug. She'd seen that kind of abandonment before. Not in missing persons cases, but in the aftermath of fires. Houses that families had fled in the middle of dinner, leaving behind the ordinary details of their lives as if they might return any moment. The difference was, fire victims usually had somewhere to go back to eventually. Did anyone look for them? Of course they did. Sheriff Hawthorne, Ben Hawthorne, he's retired now. He searched those mountains for weeks. Called in the state police, had volunteers combing every trail and creek bed. Never found so much as a piece of clothing. Roy's expression darkened. Some folks think they just up and left, started fresh somewhere else. But Maria's sister down in Colorado said she never heard from them again. Said Maria would never have left without saying goodbye. Scout had moved further into the trees, his golden coat disappearing between the pines. Dell whistled, a sharp note that usually brought him running. Instead, he paused, looked back at her with something that looked almost like apology, then continued into the forest. "I'd better get him," Dell said, setting down her coffee mug. "He's getting too old to be wandering off alone. Be careful up there," Roy called after her. "That country's beautiful, but it doesn't forgive mistakes." Dell had spent enough time in dangerous places to know good advice when she heard it. She grabbed her jacket and a flashlight from the cabin, then followed Scout's trail into the pine forest. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of snow, though it was still early October. These mountains had their own schedule, and winter came when it pleased. The trail Scout had taken wasn't really a trail at all, just a deer path that wound between the trees with the casual logic of animals who knew the forest better than any surveyor. Dell's boots found purchase on the rocky ground, muscle memory from countless wilderness rescues guiding her steps. She'd always been comfortable in wild places, maybe because they were honest about their dangers. Fire and falling trees and sudden weather, these were threats you could see coming. Unlike the kind of danger that crept up behind you in the dark, Scout's tracks were clear in the soft earth between the rocks, leading steadily southeast toward the higher elevations. Dell followed at a steady pace, calling his name every few minutes and listening for the crash of underbrush that would signal his return. Instead, the forest remained quiet except for the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant tap of a woodpecker working a dead snag. After an hour of climbing, Dell crested a ridge and found herself looking down into a narrow valley she'd never seen before. Fern Hollow spread below her like a cupped hand, protected by steep sides and thick with the kind of old-growth timber that made the air feel heavy and green. At the valley's heart, almost hidden among the trees, she could see the weathered roof of a cabin. The sight of it sent an unexpected chill through her chest. Even from a distance, the place felt wrong somehow, not abandoned so much as interrupted, as if whoever lived there had stepped outside to check the weather and simply forgotten to come back in. Scout stood at the valley's edge, no longer moving forward but unwilling to return. His body language spoke of conflicting loyalties, the pull of whatever drew him toward that cabin, warring with his instinct to stay with his pack. Dell had seen that same expression on his face during thunderstorms, when he wanted to hide under the bed but couldn't bear to leave her side. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, settling onto her knees beside him. Scout leaned against her shoulder, warm and solid and familiar, but his attention remained fixed on the cabin below. "What's down there that's got you so worked up?" The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke that made Dell's heart skip. Someone was down there. Someone was living in the cabin that had been abandoned for 30 years, burning wood and making coffee and going about the ordinary business of daily life. But even as the thought formed, Dell realized her mistake. The smoke was too thin, too scattered. Not the thick grey column of an active fire, but the lingering trace of smoke that had been absorbed into wood and stone over years of use. The cabin wasn't occupied. It was haunted by the memory of occupation, holding on to the scent of fires that had burned out long ago. Scout whined softly, a sound that carried more longing than fear. Whatever was down there, he wanted to go to it. Had been going to it, apparently, despite Dell's assumption that he spent his days sleeping in the sun and chasing the occasional squirrel. Dell stood, brushing pine needles from her knees. The smart thing would be to take Scout home, maybe mention to Roy that someone should check on the old Torino place. She had come to these mountains to escape other people's tragedies, not to seek them out, but Scout's expression held a kind of desperate hope that reminded her of victims she'd pulled from burning buildings. People who trusted her to lead them to safety, even when she wasn't sure of the way herself. "All right," she said finally. "But we stay together, and we don't touch anything." The descent into Fern Hollow took another 30 minutes. Following a switchbacked path that had once been maintained, but now grew wild with mountain laurel and serviceberry. Scout moved ahead with purpose now, his uncertainty replaced by the confidence of a dog who knew exactly where he was going. Dell followed more cautiously, noting the way the trees seemed to lean inward as they descended, creating a canopy so thick that the valley floor felt like twilight, even at midday. The cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a creek that ran fast and clear over smooth stones. It was larger than Dell had expected, built from local timber and fieldstone, with the kind of solid craftsmanship that suggested people who planned to stay. A covered porch ran along the front, its support posts carved with simple decorative flourishes that spoke of pride in the work. If not for the broken shutter hanging by one hinge and the wild growth of vines across the foundation, it could have been any mountain home waiting for its family to return from town. Scout trotted up to the front door and sat down, his tail wagging slowly as he looked back at Dell with unmistakable expectation. This was where he'd been coming. This was what had drawn him away from the comfortable life they'd built together. But why? Dell approached the cabin cautiously, her firefighter's training, making her alert to structural damage and potential hazards. The roof looked sound, though missing a few shingles. The porch steps were solid under her weight. When she tried the front door, it opened easily on hinges that barely squeaked, as if someone had oiled them recently. The smell hit her first, not the musty odor of abandonment she'd expected, but something closer to the lingering scent of a life recently lived. Coffee and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of old flowers. The air inside the cabin felt still but not stagnant, as if the place had been holding its breath for 30 years. Waiting for someone to come home, Dell's flashlight beam cut through the cabin's dim interior, revealing a scene that made her breath catch in her throat. The place wasn't abandoned, it was preserved, as if time had simply stopped moving forward on an ordinary morning 30 years ago. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, its contents long since evaporated, but the cup itself positioned as if someone had just set it down. A newspaper lay folded beside it, the date clearly visible, October 15th, 1993. Scout padded past her into the main room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor with the confidence of familiarity. He moved directly to a braided rug in front of the stone fireplace and settled down with a satisfied sigh, as if he'd finally arrived where he belonged. Dell watched him with growing unease. Her dog had never been in this cabin before. She was certain of that, yet he acted like he was coming. Home? The living room held the kind of comfortable furniture that spoke of a family's accumulated history rather than a decorator's vision. A worn leather armchair faced the fireplace, a hand-knitted afghan draped over its back. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with paperback novels and technical manuals about surveying and geology. On the mantelpiece, framed photographs showed a young Hispanic woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a tall man with work-hardened hands and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Dell moved closer to examine the photographs, her flashlight revealing details that made the family's absence feel immediate and wrong. Maria Torino had the kind of face that suggested laughter came easily, her arm wrapped around her daughter in the casual intimacy of a mother who never doubted she'd have years to take more pictures. Vincent stood slightly apart, one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder, his expression serious but not unhappy. The little girl beamed at the camera with the uninhibited joy of a child who believed the world was essentially good. On the wall beside the fireplace, a child's drawing was pinned to a corkboard, the crayon strokes bold and confident. It showed a simple house with smoke curling from the chimney, 3 stick figures standing in front, holding hands, and the words, "Home Sweet Home," written in uneven letters across the top. Sophie had signed her name in the bottom corner with a flourish that suggested pride in her artistic achievement. Del's throat tightened as she studied the drawing. She'd seen similar artwork on refrigerators and classroom walls throughout her career, the kind of innocent family portrait that every child drew and every parent treasured. But this one carried the weight of interrupted dreams, of a future that had been cut short before it could unfold. The kitchen revealed more signs of a life frozen in time. Dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink, clean and waiting to be put away. The refrigerator was empty now, but magnets still held shopping lists and Sophie's school calendar. A calendar on the wall showed October 1993, with several dates marked in Maria's careful handwriting. Sophie's school play, Vincent late shift, Mama's birthday. Del opened kitchen drawers and cabinets, finding everything in its proper place. Coffee in the pantry, sugar in a ceramic canister, dish towels folded neatly in a drawer. The ordinary details of daily life, preserved like artifacts in a museum of vanished hopes. A narrow hallway led to the cabin's bedrooms. The master bedroom held a double bed with a wedding ring quilt pulled up neatly, as if Maria had made it that final morning out of simple habit. Vincent's surveying equipment sat on a desk beneath the window, transit levels and measuring, chains and hand-drawn maps that spoke of work requiring precision and patience, but it was Sophie's room that stopped Del in her tracks. The little girl's bed was made with the imperfect care of a child trying to be helpful, the covers pulled up but not quite straight. Toys sat on shelves and in a wooden toy box painted with flowers and butterflies. Books about horses and fairy tales filled a small bookcase. And on the bedside table, a music box in the shape of a ballerina waited in frozen silence. Del lifted the music box carefully, surprised by its weight. The ballerina inside was delicate porcelain, painted with the kind of attention to detail that suggested this had been a special gift. When Del wound the key, the mechanism moved, but no sound emerged. The springs had grown silent with age. But the ballerina still turned in her eternal dance. The sight of it broke something open in Del's chest. A carefully maintained wall between her professional composure and the memories she'd been trying to escape. She thought of another little girl, one who'd owned a music box not unlike this one. Sarah Morrison, age 7, who died in a house fire 2 years ago while Del stood outside with her parents, helpless to reach the second floor where the child had hidden under her bed. Too frightened by the smoke and flames to call out for help, Del had carried Sarah's body from that house herself, had felt the terrible lightness of a life cut short, had faced the parents' questions that she couldn't answer. Why hadn't they heard her calling? Why hadn't Del gotten there sooner? Why did some people get to go home safely while others vanished into smoke and silence? The music box trembled in Del's hands, and she realized she was crying. The tears came without warning, carrying with them 2 years' worth of suppressed grief and guilt. She'd thought moving to the mountains would help her escape the weight of other people's tragedies. But here she was, surrounded by the remnants of another family's interrupted life. Feeling the same helpless rage at the unfairness of loss, Scout appeared in the doorway, drawn by some canine instinct that recognized her distress. He pressed against her legs, warm and solid and alive, reminding her that some things endured even when others were lost. Del set the music box back on the bedside table and knelt to scratch behind Scout's ears, letting his steady presence anchor her to the present moment. "What happened here, boy?" she whispered. "Where did they go?" Scout had no answers, but his calm acceptance of the cabin's atmosphere told her something important. Whatever had happened to the Torino family, it hadn't left behind the kind of violence that would make an animal nervous. The place felt sad, but not threatening, abandoned but not cursed. Del spent another hour moving through the cabin. documenting what she found with the methodical attention of someone trained to investigate scenes. Clothes still hung in closets. Food containers sat in the pantry, their contents long since spoiled, but the containers themselves clean and organized. In Vincent's desk, she found bills marked paid and letters from Maria's family in New Mexico, evidence of a life lived with attention to ordinary responsibilities. But the more she saw, the less sense it made. People didn't simply vanish from the middle of their lives, leaving behind everything they owned and everyone they loved. Even if they'd wanted to start fresh somewhere else, they would have taken photographs and keepsakes, the irreplaceable pieces of their history. Maria would have taken the music box at least. Vincent would have taken his surveying equipment. Sophie would have taken her favorite doll, the one that sat on her bed, with button eyes that seemed to watch Dell move through the room. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen through the cabin's windows, Dell knew she couldn't simply walk away and pretend she'd never seen this place. The Torino family deserved better than to be forgotten, their story left unfinished and their belongings abandoned to time and weather. Whatever had happened here 30 years ago, it connected to something larger than a simple missing persons case. Scout rose from his place by the fireplace and moved to the front door. But his reluctance was clear. He wanted to stay in this place that had somehow called to him. But his loyalty to Dell was stronger than whatever drew him here. "We'll come back," Dell promised him, though she wasn't sure why she made that commitment. "We'll figure this out." As they left the cabin and began the climb back to Dell's place, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by anything threatening, but by the weight of unfinished business, by questions that had waited 30 years for someone to ask them. The Torino family had been forgotten by everyone except the mountains themselves, and the mountains had a long memory. By the time they reached her own cabin, Dell had made a decision that would have surprised her that morning. She was going to find out what had happened to Vincent and Maria and Sophie Torino, not because she was bored or looking for purpose, but because some disappearances were too complete to be believed, and some silences were too loud to ignore. The fire department badge in her drawer had been earned by running toward danger when everyone else ran away. Maybe it was time to remember that about herself. Dell returned to the Torino cabin the next morning with a thermos of coffee and the kind of systematic approach she'd learned from years of fire investigation. If the family had left clues about their disappearance, she was going to find them. Scout trotted beside her with obvious pleasure, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this particular adventure. The morning light revealed details she'd missed in the previous day's twilight exploration. The cabin's exterior showed signs of careful maintenance that couldn't be 30 years old. Fresh caulking around the windows, recently repaired steps, a woodpile that looked like it had been stacked within the last few seasons. Someone had been caring for this place, but who? Inside, Dell began a methodical search of every room, looking for anything that might explain the family's sudden departure. She photographed everything with her phone, creating a visual record that she could study later. In the kitchen, she found a grocery list in Maria's handwriting: milk, bread, apples, Sophie's lunch meat. Ordinary items for an ordinary week with no hint of urgency or fear. Sophie's room drew her back repeatedly. The music box sat exactly where she'd left it, the ballerina frozen mid-dance. Dell wound the mechanism again, hoping it might have loosened overnight, but the springs remained silent. The toy box yielded a collection of dolls and books that spoke of a child loved but not spoiled, quality items chosen with care rather than expensive toys bought to impress. Among Sophie's books, Dell found a small diary with a lock that had long since broken. The pages were filled with the kind of innocent observations that made Dell's chest ache. "Today I saw a deer by the creek, and she had a baby with spots. Daddy is teaching me to use the compass he got me for my birthday. Mama made cookies and let me lick the spoon." But the final entries, dated just days before the family's disappearance, carried a different tone. There were men in suits talking to Daddy on the porch. "Mama made me stay inside, but I could hear them through the window." Daddy sounded angry. 2 days later, Mama has been crying when she thinks I'm not looking. She keeps checking the locks on all the doors. Dell sat back on her heels, the diary heavy in her hands. These weren't the words of a family planning to start fresh somewhere else. These were the words of people who were afraid. Scout had found his own way to help with the investigation. He moved through the cabin with purpose, occasionally stopping to sniff at particular spots, or to paw gently at things that caught his attention. In the living room, he spent long minutes examining a section of floor near the bookshelf, his nose working overtime as if he'd detected something important. Dell knelt beside him and ran her hands over the floorboards. One section felt slightly different from the rest. Not loose exactly, but less firmly seated. She worked her fingers around the edges until she found a board that lifted easily, revealing a small, hollow space beneath. Inside the hiding place, wrapped in oilcloth, she found more of Sophie's writings. Not a diary this time, but loose sheets of paper covered with a child's careful script. The content made Dell's blood run cold. The scary men came back today. Daddy told me if anything happens, I should run to the hiding place by the creek and wait for help to come. Another sheet. Mama packed a bag and put it under my bed. She said it's just in case, but her hands were shaking when she said it, and finally, in writing that looked rushed and frightened, I can hear them outside. Mama said to write everything down, so if something happens to us, someone will know. The men want Daddy to give them his maps, the ones he keeps in his special box. Daddy says the maps show something important that belongs to our family, not to them. Dell's hands trembled as she read the final entry. They're coming up the porch steps now. Mama is hiding this under the floor like she showed me. If you find this, please tell someone that we didn't want to leave. We wanted to stay in our home forever. The implications hit Dell like a physical blow. The Torino family hadn't disappeared voluntarily. They'd been taken 30 years ago, while the rest of Pine Ridge went about their daily lives. A family had been torn from their home by people who wanted something Vincent had found or discovered in his work as a surveyor. Scout whined softly, pressing against Dell's side as if he sensed her distress. She gathered the papers carefully, her mind already racing ahead to what she needed to do next. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was evidence of a crime that had been covered up for 3 decades. But who would listen to her? Who in Pine Ridge could she trust with information this explosive? Roy Dalton seemed like an honest man, but he was also someone who'd lived in this community for decades, with ties and loyalties she couldn't begin to understand. Sheriff Hawthorne was retired, but he was the one who'd conducted the original investigation. Had he missed these clues, or had he chosen not to find them? Dell spent the rest of the morning searching for Vincent's special box that Sophie had mentioned. She found it finally in the bedroom closet, a fireproof metal container that required a key she didn't have. The lock was old but sturdy, designed to protect important documents from fire and theft. She carried the box outside and sat on the cabin's front porch while Scout dozed in a patch of sunlight. The mountains stretched away in all directions, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere in this wilderness, Vincent Torino had found something valuable enough to kill for. Somewhere in these hills, 3 people had been silenced to protect someone else's secret. The weight of the metal box in her lap reminded Dell of another weight she'd carried, the responsibility of knowing when people were in danger and choosing whether to act. 2 years ago, she'd arrived at the Morrison house fire, minutes too late to save a little girl, who'd hidden under her bed instead of running to safety. Today, she held evidence that might finally bring justice to another family that had been failed by the people meant to protect them. Scout opened one eye and looked at her with the patient wisdom of a dog who understood that some problems required thinking through. The sun warmed Dell's face, and for a moment she could imagine herself setting the box aside, walking away from the Torino cabin and returning to the quiet life she'd built for herself in the mountains. But Sophie's final words echoed in her mind. If you find this, please tell someone that we didn't want to leave. A child's desperate plea for someone to remember. someone to care, someone to seek justice when the people who should have protected her family had failed. Dell stood up, the metal box clutched against her chest, and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to open Vincent's box. She was going to learn what secret had cost the Torino family their lives. And she was going to make sure that after 30 years of silence, someone finally told their story. Back at her own cabin, Dell spent an hour working on Vincent's lock with tools from her emergency kit before admitting defeat. The metal box would require either the original key or professional help, neither of which she was likely to find in Pine Ridge. Without raising questions she wasn't ready to answer, she settled for examining the box's exterior, looking for clues about its contents. The manufacturer's label indicated it was designed for important documents, and scratches around the lock suggested it had been opened frequently. Whatever Vincent had kept inside, he'd accessed it regularly right up until his disappearance. Scout watched her efforts with the patient attention of a dog who understood that humans sometimes needed to work through problems at their own pace. When Dell finally set the box aside in frustration, he padded over and rested his head on her knee, offering wordless comfort. "What do you think, boy?" Dell asked, scratching behind his ears. "Should we drive into town and see what else we can learn about our missing family?" The trip to Pine Ridge took 20 minutes along the winding mountain road. Dell had made this journey dozens of times since moving to the mountains, but today the familiar route felt different, charged with purpose rather than simple necessity. The Torino mystery had awakened something in her that she thought she'd left behind with her firefighter's badge. Mabel Hendricks looked up from restocking shelves when Dell entered the general store, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Morning, Dell. Roy said you were asking about the old Torino place yesterday." "I found Scout wandering up that way," Dell said carefully. "Thought I'd better check on the property, make sure no one was camping illegally or anything." Mabel's expression grew more serious. "That's good of you. Poor family deserves better than having their place turned into a party spot for kids from town." She paused in her shelving. "You didn't go inside, did you?" The question carried an undertone that made Dell's instincts prickle. "Why would that be a problem?" "Oh, it's not a problem exactly," Mabel said quickly. "It's just that place has been sealed up for so long, might not be safe. Old buildings can be tricky, rotten floorboards, bad wiring, that sort of thing." Dell nodded, as if accepting the explanation, but something in Mabel's tone suggested she was being warned away, rather than simply cautioned about structural hazards. "Did you know the family well?" "Well enough. Maria used to bring Sophie in here for penny candy on Saturdays. Sweet little girl, always polite, always said thank you." Mabel's voice softened with genuine fondness. "Vincent was quiet, but he was good people. Worked hard, loved his family, minded his own business." "What kind of work did he do exactly?" "Surveying for the mining companies mostly. Good steady work in those days, before the environmental regulations made everything so complicated." Mabel's tone carried the faint disapproval of someone who remembered simpler times. Vincent had a real talent for reading the land, understanding what was under the surface. Companies trusted his reports. Dell felt a spark of interest. "Was he working on anything particular when the family disappeared?" Mabel's hand stilled on the shelf, and for a moment she looked like someone trying to decide how much to say. "I wouldn't know about his work specifically. Vincent wasn't one to talk business with folks like me." But her evasion felt deliberate, as if she was choosing not to remember rather than genuinely forgetting. Dell filed that observation away and tried a different approach. "The sheriff at the time, Ben Hawthorne, did he do a thorough investigation?" "Oh yes, Ben was very thorough," Mabel said quickly. "Searched those mountains for weeks, brought in dogs and everything. If there'd been anything to find, Ben would have found it." Again, the defensive tone suggested answers that had been rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Dell thanked Mabel for her time and left the store with the feeling that she'd learned more from what hadn't been said than from the actual conversation. The Pine Ridge Library occupied a small building next to the post office, its collection modest but well-maintained. Harold Finch, the librarian, looked up from his computer when Dell entered. his face brightening with the expression of a man who didn't get many visitors. "Mrs. Waverly, what brings you to our little treasure trove of knowledge?" "I'm hoping you might have some old newspapers from 1993, Dell said. "I'm curious about the local history, particularly anything about mining operations in the area." Harold's enthusiasm was genuine and helpful. Within minutes, he'd pulled up microfilm records from the Pine Ridge Gazette, scrolling through issues from late 1993. The headlines were typical small-town fare, school board meetings, harvest festivals, high school football scores. But Dell found what she was looking for in an October 20th edition. "Local family reported missing," the headline read, followed by a brief article that added little to what Roy had already told her. Vincent, Maria, and Sophie Torino had been reported missing when Vincent failed to show up for work. The car remained in the driveway, and there were no signs of struggle at their home, but the follow-up articles told a more interesting story. A week later, the paper reported that the search had been called off due to early snow. 2 weeks after that, a brief mention that the case remained open, but that investigators believed the family had likely left the area voluntarily. And then, nothing. No anniversary articles, no updates, no mention of the Torinos ever again. "That's odd," Harold murmured, reading over Dell's shoulder. "Usually missing persons cases get more coverage than that, especially when children are involved." Dell scrolled back through earlier issues, looking for anything about Vincent's work. She found several mentions of surveying projects in the mountains, including one that made her pulse quicken. "Local surveyor discovers significant mineral deposits." The article, dated September 1993, mentioned Vincent Torino's work for Cascade Mining Company, but gave no specifics about what he'd found. "Harold, do you know anything about the mining operations around here in the 90s? The librarian pushed his glasses up his nose thoughtfully. "Some. There was a lot of interest in gold mining back then, before the environmental impact studies made it too expensive for most companies. Cascade Mining had several claims in the area, but I don't think they ever developed them." "What happened to Cascade Mining?" "Bought out by a larger company, I believe. Most of their records would be with the county assessor's office now, if they still exist." Dell thanked Harold and gathered her notes, her mind working through the implications. Vincent had discovered something valuable just weeks before his family's disappearance. The investigation had been quietly shelved despite the suspicious circumstances. And 30 years later, someone was still maintaining the Torino cabin as if the family might return any day. The drive back to her cabin gave Dell time to think through what she'd learned. The pattern was becoming clear. Vincent had found something that powerful interests wanted to keep quiet, and when he wouldn't cooperate, his family had paid the price. But who had the power to make 3 people disappear and keep their fate secret for 30 years? Scout greeted her return with obvious relief, as if he'd been worried she might not come back. Together, they walked to her mailbox, where Roy had left another delivery. Among the usual bills and catalogues was an envelope with no return address, postmarked locally. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in block letters. "Some things are better left buried. Ask yourself if finding the truth is worth losing everything you've built here." Dell's hands didn't shake as she read the warning, but her heart rate increased with the familiar spike of adrenaline that came with confirmed danger. Someone had been watching her, had seen her visits to the Torino cabin, and was concerned enough to send a threat. But the threat also confirmed something important. She was on the right track. People didn't waste time warning others away from dead ends. That evening, as Dell sat on her porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, she found herself thinking about the different kinds of courage required at different stages of life. At 30, she'd run into burning buildings because she was young enough to believe she was invulnerable. At 58, she knew exactly how vulnerable she was and how much she had to lose. But she was old enough to understand that some things were worth the risk. Scout curled up beside her chair, his presence steady and reassuring. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And somewhere in the darkness of Fern Hollow, The Torino cabin waited with its secrets and its silent plea for justice. The anonymous threat had been meant to frighten her away, but it had accomplished exactly the opposite. Del Waverly had spent 30 years answering calls for help, and she recognized one when she heard it, even when it came from the past. Written in a child's desperate handwriting and hidden under floorboards for 3 decades. Tomorrow, she would find a way to open Vincent's metal box. Tomorrow, she would learn what secret had been worth killing for. And tomorrow, she would begin the process of making sure that whoever had silenced the Torino family would finally face the consequences of their actions. Del returned to the Torino cabin the next morning, armed with a crowbar and a determination that surprised her with its intensity. The anonymous threat had done exactly what it wasn't supposed to do. It had convinced her that she was closing in on something important enough to kill for. This time, she approached the cabin more cautiously, scanning the surrounding forest for signs that she was being watched. Scout seemed relaxed, but Del had learned to trust both his instincts and her own. If someone wanted to monitor her activities, these mountains offered plenty of concealment. Inside the cabin, she went directly to Vincent's metal box. The crowbar made quick work of the lock, though she felt a pang of guilt at destroying what might be the last intact piece of Vincent's careful security measures. But Sophie's hidden messages had made it clear that time for gentle approaches had run out 30 years ago. The box contained exactly what she'd expected, and more. Vincent's surveying documents filled most of the space, hand-drawn maps, soil composition reports, and geological surveys that documented his work throughout the region. But what caught Del's attention immediately was a separate folder marked Personal Confidential in Vincent's careful handwriting. Inside the folder, she found correspondence that made her blood run cold. Letters from Cascade Mining Company, dated September and October 1993, started politely enough. The first requested copies of Vincent's survey data from his work in the Fern Hollow area. Vincent's carbon-copied responses were professional but firm. The data belonged to him as an independent contractor, and he would not share it without compensation and written agreements about its use. The tone of subsequent letters grew increasingly hostile. The mining company's final communication, dated just 3 days before the family's disappearance, was barely veiled threat. Mr. Torino, your continued refusal to cooperate with our reasonable requests is preventing the development of resources that could benefit the entire community. We trust you will reconsider your position before circumstances require more direct intervention. But it was what she found next that made Del's hands tremble. Maria's prayer book, a worn Spanish Bible with pressed flowers marking favorite passages, contained handwritten notes in the margins that documented a family's growing terror. Vincent says the men came to his office today. They offered money, then more money, then made it clear the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever. Another entry, in Maria's increasingly shaky handwriting, found boot prints around the cabin this morning. Someone was watching us sleep. Vincent has started carrying his rifle when he checks the property. And finally, in what must have been Maria's last entry, Sophie is so frightened she won't sleep in her own room. We've decided to leave, but Vincent insists on documenting everything first. He says if something happens to us, someone needs to know what we found and why we had to run. Del sat back on her heels, the prayer book heavy in her hands. The pressed flowers between its pages seemed to mock the idea that faith and hope could protect a family against the kind of evil that valued money more than human life. Maria had prayed for protection, had trusted in divine intervention, and had died anyway, along with her husband and daughter. The geological surveys in Vincent's folder told the story that had cost the Torino family their lives. Vincent's hand-drawn maps showed extensive gold deposits throughout the Fern Hollow area, far more valuable than anything previously discovered in the region. His notes indicated that the deposits were easily accessible, requiring minimal environmental disruption for extraction. For a mining company in 1993, before current environmental regulations, it would have been worth millions. But the land belonged to the Torino family. Vincent's grandfather had homesteaded the property in the 1920s, and the family held clear title to both surface and mineral rights. Cascade Mining's only legal option was to buy the land at fair market value, a cost that would have consumed most of their projected profits, so they had chosen a different approach. They had made the Torino family disappear. Scout appeared in the bedroom doorway, his expression alert but not alarmed. He'd been keeping watch while Dell read through the documents, and now he moved to the window with the focused attention of a dog who detected something worth investigating. Dell joined him at the window and immediately saw what had caught his attention. A figure moved through the trees about 100 yards from the cabin, trying to stay concealed but not quite succeeding. The person was too far away to identify, but their behavior was clearly that of someone conducting surveillance, rather than simply hiking through the forest. "Looks like our anonymous letter writer decided to check on us personally," Dell murmured to Scout. "What do you think? Should we go introduce ourselves?" But even as she considered the option, the figure melted back into the forest with the skill of someone who knew these mountains well. Dell was left with the frustrating certainty that she was being watched, combined with the practical impossibility of doing anything about it in terrain that offered countless hiding places. She returned to Vincent's documents, photographing each page with her phone before carefully replacing everything in the metal box. Whatever else happened, she wanted a complete record of the evidence the Torino family had died to protect. Among the last items in the folder, she found something that made her heart race: a carbon copy of a letter Vincent had written to the FBI office in Denver, dated October 12, 1993. In it, he detailed Cascade Mining's threats and requested federal investigation of what he termed criminal conspiracy to deprive citizens of their legal property rights through intimidation and extortion. The letter was marked, sent in Vincent's handwriting, with a note that he'd driven to Denver personally to deliver it, rather than trusting local postal services, which meant that somewhere in FBI files there should be a record of Vincent's complaint and evidence that federal authorities had been notified of his situation 3 days before his family vanished. Dell felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. If the FBI had received Vincent's letter and done nothing to protect his family, then the conspiracy was bigger than just a mining company and local law enforcement. And if the conspiracy was that extensive, then her own safety was far more precarious than she'd realized. Scout whined softly, picking up on her emotional state with the sensitivity of a dog who'd learned to read human stress signals. Dell reached down to scratch his ears, grateful for his steady presence in a situation that was growing more complicated and dangerous by the hour. "We're in over our heads, aren't we, boy?" she said softly. "But we can't stop now, not when we're the only ones who know what really happened to them." The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the still air. Dell could almost imagine Maria moving through these rooms, making coffee and tidying up, while Vincent worked at his desk and Sophie played with her dolls. The ordinary happiness of a family that had no idea their love for each other would make them targets. But imagining their happiness also meant imagining their terror when that happiness was destroyed. And Dell found she couldn't walk away from that terror, couldn't leave it unwitnessed and unavenged, any more than she could have walked away from a burning building with people trapped inside. The Torino family had been failed by everyone who should have protected them, but they wouldn't be failed by her. Dell's first stop the next morning was the Pine Ridge Courthouse, where county records were kept in a basement office that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic indifference. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Janet Morrison, seemed surprised by Dell's request for mining claim records from the 1990s. "Those files are pretty old," Janet said, leading Dell down a narrow aisle between towering filing cabinets. "Most people who need mining records are looking at current claims, not 30-year-old stuff." "I'm researching local history," Dell said, which was true enough. "Particularly interested in what happened to some of the mining operations that didn't pan out." Janet pulled several thick folders and set them on a metal table under fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly green. Cascade Mining Company had quite a few claims around here. They did a lot of surveying work, but never actually extracted anything significant before they sold out to Mountain West Resources. Dell spent 2 hours poring over the documents, building a picture of Cascade Mining's activities in the months before the Torino disappearance. The company had filed claims on properties throughout the region, all based on geological surveys, conducted by various contractors, including Vincent Torino, but what caught her attention was a pattern in the claims filed after October. Several properties adjacent to the Torino land had been claimed by Mountain West Resources within weeks of the family's disappearance. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Janet, do you know anything about Mountain West Resources? When did they start operating in this area? The clerk consulted a different set of files. Looks like they purchased Cascade Mining's assets in November 1993, started filing their own claims almost immediately. She paused, studying the documents more carefully. That's odd. According to this, they tried to file a claim on the Torino property in December 1993, but it was rejected because the family still held clear title. What happened after that? Nothing, as far as I can see. The property has just sat there ever since, with the taxes paid every year, but no activity on the title. Dell felt pieces clicking into place. Who pays the taxes? Janet checked her computer records. Mountain West Resources has been paying the property taxes since 1994. Legally, they can't claim ownership just by paying taxes. But it suggests they're maintaining some kind of interest in the land. The implications were staggering. Mountain West Resources had been paying to maintain the Torino property for 30 years, presumably waiting for the family to be declared legally dead so they could claim the land through abandonment proceedings. They'd been playing a decades-long waiting game, confident that their secret was safe. Dell thanked Janet and left the courthouse with her head spinning. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened in 1993, it was ongoing, with Mountain West Resources continuing to benefit from the Torino family's silence. Her next stop was the library, where Harold Finch helped her research Mountain West Resources through online databases. What she found made her stomach clench with recognition. Mountain West was a subsidiary of Meridian Corporation, one of the largest mining conglomerates in the western United States. The kind of company with enough money and political influence to make problems disappear permanently. Harold, do you remember anything about the sheriff's investigation into the Torino disappearance? Any rumors about why it was called off so quickly? The librarian looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. There were some whispers at the time that Ben Hawthorne was under pressure to wrap things up. Folks said he didn't seem happy about calling off the search, but orders came from somewhere above his pay grade. From where? Nobody knew for sure. But Ben started driving a new truck right around that time, and he suddenly had money to send his oldest boy to college. People noticed things like that in a town this size. Dell felt the familiar chill of corruption confirmed. Ben Hawthorne hadn't been incompetent, he'd been bought. And if he'd been bought 30 years ago, there was no reason to assume the corruption had ended with his retirement. That evening, Dell sat on her cabin's porch with Vincent's geological maps spread across a folding table, trying to understand exactly what he'd discovered. The gold deposits he'd documented were extensive, covering not just the Torino property, but several adjacent parcels. According to his calculations, the total value of recoverable gold could exceed $50 million at 1993 prices. At current gold prices, those deposits would be worth 10 times that amount. Scout lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to scan the forest with the alertness of a dog who knew they were being watched. Dell had stopped trying to spot their surveillance. Whoever was monitoring her activities was too skilled to be caught easily. But the knowledge that she was being observed added urgency to her investigation. Her phone rang just after sunset, the sound sharp in the mountain quiet. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize. Miss Waverly. The voice was male, older, with the careful diction of someone choosing his words deliberately. "I understand you've been asking questions about the Torino family. Who is this?" "Someone who knew Vincent and Maria. Someone who's been waiting 30 years for somebody to start asking the right questions." There was a pause, filled with the static of a bad connection. "We need to meet tonight, and you need to be very careful about who you trust." "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm probably the only person left alive who can tell you what really happened to them. And because if you keep investigating the way you have been, you're going to end up just as dead as they are." The line went dead before Dell could respond. She stared at her phone, her mind racing through the implications. Someone had been watching her investigation, someone who claimed to have answers about the Torino disappearance. But was this person a potential ally or another trap? Scout stood up, his attention focused on something in the forest. Dell followed his gaze and saw a brief flash of light among the trees. Someone signaling with a flashlight. 3 short flashes, then 3 long ones, then 3 short ones again. SOS. Whoever had called her was out there in the darkness, asking for help in the international distress signal. Dell grabbed her own flashlight and her jacket, then paused at the door. Every instinct trained by 30 years of emergency response told her to investigate, to answer a call for help. But every survival instinct warned her that this could be exactly the kind of trap that had destroyed the Torino family. Scout made the decision for her. He trotted to the door and whined softly, his body language indicating he sensed no immediate threat from whoever waited in the forest. Dell had learned to trust his judgment about people. Dogs were harder to fool than humans. "All right, boy," she said softly. "But we stay together, and we're ready to run if things go wrong." The signal came again from the forest. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Someone was asking for help, and Dell had never been able to ignore that particular call. She stepped into the darkness, following Scout toward whatever revelation awaited in the mountains that had already claimed too many secrets. The man waiting in the forest clearing was not at all what Dell had expected. Tommy Kellerman looked to be in his mid-40s, with the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, haunted eyes that spoke of carrying a terrible secret for far too long. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his voice carrying the same careful tone from the phone call. "I wasn't sure you would." Scout approached Tommy without hesitation, accepting ear scratches with the easy trust of a dog who sensed no threat. Dell relaxed slightly but kept her flashlight ready and her escape routes mapped. "You said you knew what happened to the Torino family." Tommy nodded, his expression heavy with old pain. "I was 19 then, working part-time for Ben Hawthorne as a deputy. Thought I was going to make a career in law enforcement, serve my community, do some good in the world." His laugh was bitter. "I learned real quick that some communities don't want to be served, just protected from the truth. What did you see?" "More than I should have." Ben got a call that night, October 18th, 1993. Someone reported gunshots from the direction of Fern Hollow. Ben told me to stay at the station, said he'd handle it himself. But I was young and stupid and thought I might be able to help. Tommy's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating features marked by decades of guilt. I followed Ben up to the Torino place, staying far enough back that he wouldn't know I was there. What I saw that night has haunted me every day since. Dell felt her heart rate increase. "What did you see?" Ben wasn't there to investigate gunshots. He was there to clean up after them. Tommy took a long drag from his cigarette. There were 3 other men with him. Men in expensive suits who didn't belong in these mountains. They were loading something heavy into the back of a truck. Something wrapped in tarps. The implications hit Dell like a physical blow. The family, Vincent, Maria, and little Sophie. I watched Ben Hawthorne help cover up their murders, and I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. Tommy's voice broke with 3 decades of suppressed anguish. They drove that truck up into the old mining areas, places where the ground is easy to dig and nobody ever goes. I followed them part way, but when I realized what they were planning to do, I just couldn't watch anymore. Dell's mind reeled with the revelation. Ben Hawthorne hadn't been an incompetent investigator. He'd been an active participant in the murders. The man the community had trusted to find the missing family had helped bury them. Why didn't you report it? Tommy laughed bitterly. To who? Ben was the sheriff. The state police would have taken his word over mine. And the men with him that night. I recognized one of them from newspaper photos. Richard Meridian himself, the owner of the whole mining company. You don't accuse people like that without ironclad proof. And I was just a 19-year-old kid who'd witnessed something from a distance in the dark. Dell felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Richard Meridian had come personally to oversee the elimination of the Torino family, demonstrating just how valuable those gold deposits were to his company's interests. But you kept quiet all these years. I tried to forget. Moved away from Pine Ridge, spent 20 years working construction in Colorado. Thought maybe if I stayed away long enough, it would stop eating at me. Tommy dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. But you can't outrun that kind of guilt. When I heard someone was finally asking questions about the Torinos, I knew I had to come back and tell what I know. Why now? Why didn't you come forward before? Tommy's expression grew even more troubled. Because Ben Hawthorne is dying, cancer, and before he goes, he's planning to make sure his secrets die with him, including getting rid of anyone who might threaten them. Dell felt cold fear wash over her. What do you mean? Ben knows you've been to the cabin. He knows you found things you shouldn't have found, and he's scared enough to do something about it. Tommy's voice carried the urgency of someone who'd wrestled with his conscience and finally chosen the right side. He's been in contact with people from Mountain West Resources. They're planning to stage an accident, make it look like you had a hiking mishap up in the mountains. Your body would never be found, just like the Torinos. The anonymous threat Dell had received suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. It hadn't been a warning to stay away. It had been reconnaissance, confirming that she was a problem that needed to be eliminated. When? Soon, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Ben's condition is getting worse, and he doesn't have much time left to tie up loose ends. Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a weatherproof camera, the kind used by hunters to monitor game trails. I've been documenting everything I can, trying to build evidence that might finally bring them to justice. This camera was hidden near the Torino cabin. It shows the mining company people maintaining the property, keeping it preserved like some kind of shrine to their guilt. Dell examined the camera with growing excitement. If Tommy had documented Mountain West Resources' ongoing activities at the Torino property, it could provide the proof needed to connect them to the original murders. We need to get this to the FBI, Dell said. Vincent wrote to them before he died. If we can prove they ignored his warning and people died because of it, there might be federal charges. There's more, Tommy said grimly. I followed the money trail over the years, tracked what happened to the people involved. Most of the men who were there that night are dead now. Natural causes, accidents, one suicide. But Ben is still alive, and so is Richard Meridian's son Marcus, who inherited the company. They're the last two who know the truth, and they're desperate to keep it buried. Scout suddenly lifted his head, his attention focused on something in the distance. Both Dell and Tommy froze, listening to the night sounds of the forest. After a moment, Scout relaxed, but Dell remained alert. We can't stay here much longer, she said. If Ben knows about tonight's meeting, he doesn't. I've been careful, but Tommy's voice carried uncertainty. At least I hope he doesn't. Dell made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Tommy, I need you to take this camera and drive to Denver tonight. Go straight to the FBI office, ask for the agent in charge of cold cases, and tell them everything you just told me. Give them the camera and tell them to look up Vincent Torino's 1993 complaint. What about you? I'm going back to the cabin. If there's more evidence there, I need to document it before Ben and his friends decide to clean house. Dell felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with committing to a dangerous course of action. And if they are planning to stage an accident, I want to be ready for them. Tommy grabbed her arm. Dell, you can't take on these people alone. They've killed to protect this secret before. And they won't hesitate to kill again. I won't be alone, Dell said, looking down at Scout. And I've spent 30 years dealing with dangerous situations. I know how to stay alive. But even as she said it, Dell understood the magnitude of what she was facing. A dying sheriff with nothing left to lose, a mining company worth billions of dollars, and a secret that had been protected by murder for 3 decades. Against those odds, her experience fighting fires seemed almost quaint. Still, the Torino family deserved justice, and Sophie's desperate plea echoed in her memory. If you find this, please tell someone that we didn't want to leave. Dell had found it. And now she was going to make sure someone finally listened. As Tommy disappeared into the darkness with his camera and his 30 years of guilt, Dell turned back toward her cabin with Scout at her side. Somewhere in the mountains around them, powerful people were planning her death. But she'd faced death before, and she'd learned that sometimes the only way out was straight through the fire. Dell spent the pre-dawn hours preparing for what she suspected would be her final visit to the Torino cabin. If Ben Hawthorne and his allies were planning to eliminate her, she wanted to be ready. More importantly, she wanted to leave behind enough evidence to ensure that even her death wouldn't bury the truth about what had happened to the Torino family. She wrote out everything she'd discovered, creating multiple copies of her notes and photographs. One set went into a sealed envelope addressed to Tommy Kellerman in Denver, with instructions to open it only if she failed to contact him within 48 hours. Another went into her safety deposit box at the Pine Ridge Bank, along with a letter to her sister in Oregon explaining the situation. The third set she uploaded to a cloud storage account, with automated instructions to email the files to multiple news organizations if she didn't log in to reset the timer every 12 hours. It was a dead man's switch, crude but effective. If something happened to her, the Torino story would survive. Scout watched these preparations with the patient attention of a dog who understood that something significant was happening. When Dell pulled her emergency radio from its charging station, the same type she'd carried during her firefighting career, he moved to the door with obvious anticipation. "You know we're going back, don't you, boy?" Dell asked, checking the radio's battery and testing its range. The device could reach emergency services anywhere in the county, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. If things went wrong, she wanted to be able to call for help from people who weren't part of Ben Hawthorne's corruption. The morning mist hung thick in the valleys as Dell and Scout made their way toward Fern Hollow. This time, Dell chose a different route, approaching the cabin from the north through terrain that would make it harder for anyone to track their movements. Her firefighting experience had taught her to always have multiple escape routes, and the lessons applied as much to human predators as to natural disasters. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, but Dell's instincts prickled with warning. Something felt different, not wrong exactly, but altered in ways too subtle to identify immediately. Scout sensed it too, his body language tense as he investigated familiar scents with unusual intensity. Inside, Dell went directly to Sophie's room, drawn by an impulse she couldn't quite explain. The music box still sat on the bedside table, its broken mechanism silent despite her attempts to wind it. But as she examined it more closely in the morning light, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small crack in the base that looked deliberate rather than accidental. Working carefully, she found that the base was designed to open, revealing a hidden compartment that contained a small key. The key was too small for the music box mechanism itself, but it was exactly the right size for something else Dell had seen in the cabin. Vincent's desk in the master bedroom contained several locked drawers that she'd been unable to open during her previous searches. The key from Sophie's music box opened the smallest of these drawers, revealing a collection of items that made Dell's heart race. Photographs, additional documents, and what appeared to be audio recordings on small cassette tapes. The photographs showed men in business suits standing with Ben Hawthorne near the Torino cabin. Even in the slightly blurred images, Dell recognized the face she'd seen in newspaper archives. Richard Meridian, owner of Meridian Corporation, and the man Tommy had identified as being present during the murders. But it was the cassette tapes that proved most valuable. Vincent had been recording his conversations with the mining company representatives, documenting their escalating threats and demands. Dell found a small tape recorder in the desk drawer and played back conversations that chilled her blood. "Mr. Torino, you're being unreasonable," a cultured voice said on the first tape. "We're offering you fair market value for land that's basically worthless for anything except mining." Vincent's response was calm but firm. "It's not worthless to my family. We've lived here for 3 generations, and we plan to live here for 3 more. That may not be possible," the voice continued, with barely concealed menace. "This area is going to be developed whether you cooperate or not. The question is whether you want to profit from that development or become an obstacle to it." Later tapes revealed the threats becoming more explicit. References to accidents that could happen to people who lived in isolated areas. Mentions of families who'd faced unfortunate circumstances when they stood in the way of progress. And finally, on what must have been the last recording, the sound of Vincent's voice shaking with fear as he documented preparations to flee. "If something happens to us, I want people to know we didn't leave willingly. We love our home. We love our life here, but they've made it clear they'll kill us rather than let us keep the land. Maria is packing tonight, and we'll leave in the morning. But I'm hiding this recording where Sophie can find it if she ever comes back to look for us." Dell felt tears on her cheeks as she listened to a man's desperate attempt to leave some trace of his family's fate. Vincent had known they were going to die, had known their killers would try to make their disappearance look voluntary, and had done everything he could to preserve the truth. But Vincent's precautions hadn't been enough to save his family. They'd been betrayed by the very man who should have protected them. Ben Hawthorne had used his position as sheriff to ensure that the murder victim's own evidence never saw the light of day. Scout's sudden alert posture interrupted Dell's thoughts. He was staring toward the cabin's front window, his hackles raised in warning. Dell moved carefully to look outside and saw what had caught his attention. 2 vehicles parked at the edge of the clearing. Expensive SUVs that hadn't been there when they arrived. 4 men emerged from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this kind of work before. Dell recognized Ben Hawthorne immediately, even though 30 years and illness had aged him dramatically. The other 3 were younger, wearing the kind of casual outdoor clothing that was meant to look innocent but probably concealed weapons. Dell's emergency radio crackled to life before she could reach for it. "Ms. Waverly, this is Sheriff Hawthorne. I know you're in there, and I know you've found things you shouldn't have found. Come out so we can discuss this like reasonable people." Dell keyed the radio, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she activated the emergency beacon that would alert state authorities to her location. If she disappeared now, at least someone would know where to start looking. "Sheriff Hawthorne," she finally responded. "I think we both know this conversation isn't going to end with reasonable discussion." Hawthorne's laugh carried no humor. "You're probably right about that. But I figured I owed you the courtesy of an explanation before we cleaned up this mess once and for all. The same courtesy you gave the Torino family." There was a pause before Hawthorne responded, and when he did, his voice carried the weariness of a man who'd carried a terrible secret too long. The Torinos were collateral damage in something much bigger than they understood. Vincent stumbled onto gold deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he was too stubborn to accept that some things are bigger than individual property rights. Dell moved to the back of the cabin, checking sightlines and escape routes. The forest behind the cabin was thick enough to provide cover, but she'd have to cross open ground to reach it. Scout stayed close beside her, his body language indicating he was ready to follow her lead. "So you murdered them," Dell said into the radio. "I didn't murder anyone," Hawthorne replied, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "I was paid to look the other way, while other people solved a problem. The Torinos were given multiple opportunities to sell their land and leave quietly. They chose to stay and fight, and that choice had consequences. They chose to defend their home. They chose to stand in the way of progress that would have benefited hundreds of people in this community. Jobs, economic development, a future for young people who otherwise would have to leave Pine Ridge to find work. Hawthorne's voice grew stronger, as if he were convincing himself as much as Dell. Sometimes individual sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Dell felt sick listening to the rationalization. Tell me about the greater good when you were helping to bury an 8-year-old girl. The radio was silent for a long moment. When Hawthorne spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. That's enough talking. You've got 2 choices, Miss Waverly. You can come out with your hands visible, and we'll make this quick and clean. Or you can make us come in after you, and it won't be nearly as pleasant. Dell looked around the cabin one more time, memorizing details that might be important. Vincent's cassette recordings were still playing, his voice echoing from 30 years ago with warnings about exactly the situation she now faced. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to face the same fate as the family whose story she'd been trying to tell. But unlike the Torinos, Dell had backup plans. Tommy was already on his way to Denver with evidence that would survive even if she didn't. Her own documentation was safely stored and programmed to surface automatically if she disappeared, and somewhere in the mountains above them, her emergency beacon was broadcasting her location to state authorities who had no connection to Ben Hawthorne's corruption. "Scout," she whispered, "when I give the signal, you run for the forest and don't look back. Find your way home and wait for the good guys to show up." Scout's intelligent eyes seemed to understand both the command and the sacrifice it implied. He whined softly, but moved toward the cabin's back door, ready to obey when the time came. Dell keyed her radio one final time. "Sheriff Hawthorne, I've got a counterproposal. Why don't you and your friends get back in your vehicles and drive away? Because in about 10 minutes, this place is going to be crawling with federal agents who are very interested in hearing about a 30-year-old murder case." The silence that followed was longer this time. Dell used it to position herself at the cabin's back window, ready to run. She could see movement near the front door. Hawthorne's men were getting ready to storm the cabin. When Hawthorne finally responded, his voice carried the cold finality of a man who'd run out of options. "You're lying. Nobody knows you're here, and nobody's coming to help you. You're just another city woman who got lost in the mountains and never made it home." "We'll see," Dell said, and switched off her radio. The attack came 60 seconds later. The front door exploded inward as 2 men hit it with coordinated force, while a third moved around to cover the back exit. But Dell was already gone, having slipped out the side window during the noise of their approach. Scout followed close behind her, both of them disappearing into the thick undergrowth that surrounded the cabin. Behind them, angry voices shouted commands and threats as Hawthorne's men realized their quarry had escaped. Dell heard the sounds of systematic destruction as they took out their frustration on the cabin's contents, smashing furniture and scattering papers in a rage that spoke of desperation rather than professional competence. But they'd made a crucial mistake. In their hurry to corner Dell, they'd underestimated both her wilderness skills and her preparation. Now she was loose in terrain she understood, carrying evidence they couldn't afford to let survive. While federal help was already on the way, the final confrontation was coming, but it would be on Dell's terms rather than theirs. After 30 years of silence, the Torino family was finally going to get the justice they deserved. Dell and Scout moved through the forest with the careful efficiency of a team that had worked together in dangerous situations before. Dell's firefighting experience had taught her to navigate difficult terrain under pressure, while Scout's hunting instincts made him an ideal partner for staying ahead of pursuit. They climbed steadily through thick pine forest, putting distance between themselves and the cabin while staying close enough to monitor Hawthorne's activities. Dell could hear the men crashing through the underbrush below, their city shoes and business casual clothing making them clumsy in terrain that required specialized knowledge. "Spread out," Hawthorne's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "She can't have gone far, And she's got evidence that can't be allowed to surface. Dell smiled grimly at the sheriff's assumption. She'd spent 30 years responding to emergencies in wilderness areas, often in conditions far more challenging than a simple forest chase. Hawthorne's men might be dangerous, but they were operating outside their expertise. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission on the emergency frequency. "This is Colorado State Police Dispatch. We have received an emergency beacon activation from your location. Please respond with your status." Dell keyed the radio quietly, keeping her voice low. "This is Del Waverly. I'm being pursued by armed men connected to a 30-year-old murder case. I need immediate assistance at the Torino cabin in Fern Hollow." "Copy that, Ms. Waverly. Units are en route to your location. Estimated arrival 15 minutes. Can you maintain your position until assistance arrives?" "Negative. I'm being actively hunted. We'll attempt to evade until you arrive." Dell switched off the radio and looked down at Scout, who was watching her with intelligent attention. 15 minutes, boy. We just need to stay alive for 15 more minutes." The forest provided excellent cover, but Dell knew that advantage would diminish as Hawthorne's men spread out and began using more systematic search patterns. She needed to reach higher ground where she could observe their movements while remaining concealed. The climb took them along a deer trail that switched back through dense undergrowth. Scout moved ahead, his nose working constantly as he monitored for signs of their pursuers. Twice he froze and looked back at Dell with warning signals she'd learned to recognize, and both times they changed direction to avoid detection. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more organized. Hawthorne had apparently taken charge of the search, directing his men with the experience of someone who'd spent decades tracking people through difficult terrain. Dell could hear radio chatter as they coordinated their efforts to cut off her escape routes. "She's heading uphill toward the ridge," one voice reported. "Peterson, circle around to the north. Martinez, take the south approach. We'll drive her into the open ground near the mine shaft." The mention of the mine shaft sent a chill through Dell's chest. If Hawthorne was trying to drive her toward the old mining areas, it wasn't just to capture her. It was to dispose of her body in the same place where the Torino family had been buried 30 years ago. Dell changed direction immediately, angling west toward more difficult terrain that would slow down her pursuers, but also put more distance between her and the approaching state police. It was a calculated risk, but staying ahead of Hawthorne's men was more important than making it easy for help to find her. The western slope was steeper and more treacherous, with loose rock and deadfall timber that made quiet movement nearly impossible. But it also provided better concealment and more opportunities to observe the valley below. From a position behind a granite outcropping, Dell could see the cabin where it all started, its windows dark and its silence holding 30 years of secrets. Scout pressed against her leg, his body language indicating he'd detected movement below. Dell followed his gaze and saw two of Hawthorne's men working their way up the slope, moving with the careful coordination of people who knew how to hunt, but they were making the same mistake that had doomed other predators in these mountains. They were focused on their prey while ignoring their environment. Neither man noticed the third figure moving through the trees above them until it was too late. Dell watched in amazement as Tommy Kellerman appeared behind the two men, moving with the stealth of someone who'd spent his life in these mountains. Instead of going to Denver as she'd suggested, he doubled back to help her, bringing with him the knowledge of terrain that could make the difference between capture and escape. Tommy's intervention wasn't violent. He simply made enough noise to confuse the two men about Dell's location, sending them in the wrong direction while she continued her climb toward safety. It was the kind of quiet heroism that had been missing from the Torino case 30 years ago, when Tommy had been too young and too frightened to act on what he'd witnessed. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder as state police aircraft approached the search area. Help was finally coming for the Torino family, 3 decades too late, but arriving nonetheless. Dell keyed her radio one final time, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "State Police, this is Del Waverly. The suspects are armed and extremely dangerous. They're trying to reach the old mine shaft areas north of the cabin. And be advised, you're going to find more than just evidence up there. You're going to find the Torino family. The helicopter's arrival changed everything. Hawthorne's men, who had been methodically closing in on Dell's position, suddenly found themselves exposed on open mountainside with nowhere to hide. The aircraft's spotlight swept across the forest, revealing their locations to the tactical team that was fast roping down into the valley. Dell watched from her concealed position as the manhunt reversed itself. Instead of being the hunted, Hawthorne and his associates became the pursued, scrambling through unfamiliar terrain while trained law enforcement officers coordinated their capture with military precision. But Ben Hawthorne himself was moving with desperate purpose toward the mine shaft area, and Dell realized with growing alarm that he wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to destroy evidence. 30 years ago, he'd helped bury the Torino family in those abandoned mine workings. Now he was racing to ensure their remains were never found. Dell made a decision that probably saved the case. Instead of waiting for rescue, she began working her way down the mountainside toward the mine shaft, with scouts staying close beside her. If Hawthorne reached the burial site first, he might have time to collapse the shaft or otherwise make it impossible to recover the bodies that could finally prove what had happened. The old mining area was a maze of abandoned equipment and partially collapsed structures, dangerous even in daylight and potentially lethal for someone unfamiliar with its hazards. But Dell's experience with structural collapses and underground rescue made her confident she could navigate the risks. She found Hawthorne at the entrance to what appeared to be the main shaft, frantically trying to move heavy equipment that had been positioned to seal the opening. Even from a distance, Dell could see that the shaft had been deliberately blocked, not by natural collapse, but by human design. "Sheriff Hawthorne," Dell called out, her voice echoing off the rocky walls. "It's over. The state police are here, and they're going to find what you buried down there, whether you move that equipment or not." Hawthorne spun around, and Dell was shocked by his appearance. The man she'd seen earlier looked haggard, but now he appeared almost skeletal, as if the stress of the day had burned away whatever health remained to him. His hand shook as he pointed a pistol in her direction. "You should have minded your own business," he said, his voice carrying the exhausted bitterness of someone who'd carried guilt too long. The Torinos were good people, but they were in the way of something bigger than themselves. They were a family, a father, a mother, and an 8-year-old girl who drew pictures of her home. "You think I don't know that?" Hawthorne's voice cracked with 30 years of suppressed anguish. "You think I haven't seen that little girl's face every night for 30 years? But knowing something is wrong and being able to stop it are two different things." Dell moved closer, keeping her hands visible but continuing to close the distance between them. "It's not too late to do the right thing. Help us find them. Help us bring them home." "There is no right thing anymore," Hawthorne replied. "There's just living with what you've done and trying to make sure it doesn't destroy anyone else." The sound of approaching voices echoed through the mining area as the state police tactical team worked their way through the maze of abandoned equipment. Hawthorne heard them too, and Dell saw resignation settle over his features like a shroud. "Sheriff Benjamin Hawthorne," a voice called through a bullhorn. "You're surrounded. Put down your weapon and come out with your hands visible." Instead of responding to the command, Hawthorne looked directly at Dell. "The shaft goes down about 40 feet, then opens into a natural cavern. That's where they are. Vincent, Maria, and Sophie Torino, along with the camping gear we used to make it look like they'd gone hiking." Dell felt tears she hadn't expected as Hawthorne finally confessed to the crime that had haunted him for 3 decades. "Why? Why did you help them?" "Because Richard Meridian offered me more money than I'd ever seen, and because he convinced me that the Torinos would just disappear quietly if they were properly motivated." Hawthorne's laugh was hollow. "I thought we were just going to scare them into selling. I didn't know about the guns until it was too late." The tactical team was close enough now that Dell could see their silhouettes moving through the mining equipment. Hawthorne saw them too, and his grip on the pistol tightened. "Don't do this," Dell said urgently. Your confession just gave the Torino family the justice they deserved. Don't throw that away now." For a moment it seemed like Hawthorne might listen. His gun hand wavered, and Dell thought she saw something like relief cross his features. But then his radio crackled with an incoming transmission, and Marcus Meridian's voice cut through the mountain air. "Ben, if you surrender, my company will make sure your family suffers for your cooperation. You know what needs to be done." Hawthorne's face hardened with resolve, born of exhaustion and 30 years of guilt. "Tell my wife I'm sorry," he said to Dell, "and tell the Torino family that some of us never forgot them." The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, final and irreversible. 6 months later, Dell stood in the Pine Ridge Cemetery on a crisp April morning, watching as 3 simple headstones were unveiled under a sky so blue it seemed like a benediction. Vincent Torino, Maria Torino, and Sophie Torino had finally come home, their remains recovered from the mine shaft where they'd been hidden for 30 years. The cemetery was fuller than Dell had expected. Maria's sister had driven up from New Mexico with 2 adult children who remembered their aunt's stories about life in the Colorado mountains. Tommy Kellerman stood nearby, his face still marked by decades of guilt, but also showing the peace that came with finally telling the truth. Even Mabel Hendricks from the general store was there, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as the pastor spoke about justice delayed but not denied. Scout sat quietly beside Dell, his graying muzzle a reminder that he too was getting older, but his eyes still bright with the intelligence that had helped solve a 30-year-old crime. The old dog had become something of a local celebrity after news reports detailed his role in leading Dell to the abandoned cabin. Though he seemed unimpressed by his fame, the federal investigation that followed Ben Hawthorne's suicide had moved with surprising speed once the evidence was laid out clearly. Tommy's photographs and Dell's documentation, combined with Vincent's hidden cassette recordings, painted a picture of conspiracy and murder that even expensive lawyers couldn't explain away. Marcus Meridian had been arrested at his Denver office while trying to destroy company records related to the 1993 mining claims. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and federal civil rights violations. His trial was scheduled for the fall, and prosecutors were confident they had enough evidence to ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. Mountain West Resources had been dissolved, its assets frozen pending civil litigation from the Torino family's relatives. The gold deposits that Vincent had died to protect remained untouched, likely to stay that way, given the environmental regulations that now governed mining operations. Dell had testified before a federal grand jury, telling the story of her investigation and the events that led to Ben Hawthorne's final confession. The experience had been emotionally draining, but also cathartic. A chance to ensure that every detail of the Torino family's fate was officially documented and preserved. But it was Sophie's music box that had provided the most poignant evidence. Harold Finch from the library had taken it to a specialist in Denver, who'd been able to repair the broken mechanism and restore its voice. During the funeral service, the delicate notes of Für Elise had filled the church as the little ballerina danced once more, a symbol of innocence that had survived even when innocence itself had been destroyed. After the ceremony, Dell walked alone to the Torino cabin. The state had declared it a historical site, preserving it as a reminder of what happened when power and greed overcame conscience and community. But Dell went there for more personal reasons, to keep a promise she'd made to herself during those dark hours when she'd thought she might join the Torino family in their unmarked grave. The cabin looked different now, maintained by the State Parks Department, but empty of the personal belongings that had made it feel like a home interrupted rather than a house abandoned. Sophie's drawings had been removed to climate-controlled storage, along with Vincent's surveying equipment and Maria's prayer book. But the structure itself remained, bearing witness to lives lived with love and ended with violence. Dell sat on the front porch steps, where she'd first felt the weight of the family's unfinished story. Scout settled beside her with a contented sigh. His mission complete, but his loyalty unchanged. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and the promise of summer, peaceful sounds that belied the tragedy this place had witnessed. "I kept my word," Del said quietly, as if the mountains themselves might carry her message to wherever the Torino family had found peace. Someone finally listened. Someone finally cared enough to tell your story. The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet she'd first encountered here. This was the peaceful silence of closure rather than the heavy silence of buried secrets. The Torino family's story had been told, their justice achieved, and their memory honored. Del's phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy, who was now working with the state to establish a memorial fund for other missing persons cases. His message was simple. The good guys won this time. It was true, though the victory had come at a cost, measured in decades rather than days. Ben Hawthorne had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his choices, but not before confessing to crimes that had haunted him for 30 years. Sometimes justice was delayed, but it wasn't denied. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Del and Scout made their way back to their own cabin. The quiet life Del had sought when she moved to Colorado was still there waiting for her, but it had been enriched by the knowledge that she could still make a difference when circumstances demanded it. The fire department badge still sat in her drawer, but it no longer carried the weight of failure and regret. Instead, it reminded her that some callings transcended retirement, that some responsibilities lasted a lifetime, and that sometimes the most important rescues involved bringing the missing home rather than pulling them from burning buildings. Scout's collar jingled softly as they walked, the familiar sound a comfort in the gathering dusk. Behind them, the Torino cabin stood in its clearing, no longer a monument to injustice, but a testament to the truth that eventually, even the most carefully buried secrets find their way to the surface. The mountains kept their own schedule, and justice, it seemed, kept mountain time.